Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. My guest is Barbara Ann Mojica. She is an historian, a retired educator with over 40 years' experience. She is a teacher, parent advocate, blogger, top Amazon book reviewer, and author of the award-winning series Little Miss History, a children's nonfiction book series. Barbara has taught children and their families about why we need to understand our history and cultural heritage as the pathway to becoming good citizens and critical thinkers. Her books have won over 22 awards, including the 2020 Juvenile Book Award from the Independent Authors Network Association. And she has written more than 13 books in the Little Miss History series, including Travels to Sequoia National Park, the North Pole, and La Brea Tar Pits. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Nancy.
I thoroughly enjoyed the books. And even though they were for children, and even though they were of places that I have been, except the North Pole, I learned a lot about the environment, about the history. You definitely believe that we should know more about what's happened in the past, who's done what the wonderful wildlife and ecosystems are. Let's begin with your travels to the North Pole. Did you really go there?
No, unfortunately not. I flew over it once, but I haven't actually been to that one.
But many of the other places you have been, including here in Los Angeles at the La Brea Tar Pits, which is a unique resource of prehistoric fossils. I know about it. La Brea is Spanish for tar, so it's sort of tar pits, isn't it?
Exactly, yes. The tar is actually asphalt, the heavy part of crude oil. That's what you see seeping through the ground when you walk around at La Brea.
Fortunately, the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County has a branch there, the Page Museum, where you can actually watch the scientists, the paleontologists, looking at the fossils and working with them.
Yes, that's fascinating. I could stand there for hours at a time. It's called a fish bowl because that's what it looks like. I mean, it's totally open, and you can stand there and watch scientists cleaning and sorting and categorizing all of the fossils that they found, some of which are minuscule and others which are gigantic, like the bones of a mammoth or a saber-toothed tiger.
Even if you don't go into the museum, the park is a public park and open. Even if you're just walking on the sidewalk on Wilshire Boulevard next to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, you can see some recreations of the woolly mammoth or the saber-toothed tigers. Right there in the tar. You can see the tar pits still.
Yes, they've recreated the lake, and you can see exactly what it would have looked like 40,000 years ago. In the book, I give children an idea of exactly how that happened. The herbivores, which were the plant-eating animals, would go looking for food, searching for plants, and they would get stuck in these tar seeps and trapped, and then along would come the carnivores, the meat eaters, who would eat the herbivores that had already been trapped and died in the seeps, and they would get stuck. So this became a never-ending cycle. It's kind of hard for children to visualize that, but through the pictures, I tried to recreate that scenario.
Interestingly, the tar pits are very close to Hollywood. The city of Los Angeles has paved over most of the tar, but the men who developed the tar, the oil, made a fortune. You have Hancock and Page who donated land to the county so that this is preserved and protected for the public?
Right. The Hancock family had an oil drilling operation. The land was passed down from one generation to another. It was originally part of a Mexican land grant, and it was called Rancho La Brea. The family in the early part of the 1900s decided to donate 23 acres of that original ranch property to the city of Los Angeles. And George Page, he's an interesting person in his own right. George Page is the man who had the idea for the museum. He heard about the fossils and decided he wanted to have a permanent place to exhibit them. But way back, as a young child even, he was 12 when he decided to hitchhike cross country to Los Angeles. He saved his money, he had all kinds of odd jobs, and he was able to start a business shipping fruit all over the country. And that's how he made his money. He became a millionaire. He heard about the tar pits. He decided this would be wonderful opportunity to preserve history. He succeeded in opening the museum just before he died. He lived to almost 100. He did live to see the museum open.
I just loved all the bits of information about the various places that we're so familiar with, and yet you brought up new facts, new figures, new history, and it's easy reading. You can read to your child, or your child can read him or herself, but I love the drawings also. And the illustrator is your husband, Victor Ramon Mohica. He is an award-winning poet, cartoonist, screenwriter, and publisher, and he has created this character of Little Miss History wearing a park ranger type outfit with big red sunglasses on.
Well, that's an interesting story. Little Miss History is based on a younger version of myself. Those glasses, they look kind of red, but they really reflect the rose-colored glasses that I've always tried to have an optimistic outlook on life. The boots look oversized. They look kind of like a combination of hiking and army boots. And they're in memory of my father's huge feet, and my father was in the Army as well. The park ranger outfit is kind of like a hiking, outdoorsy outfit, and I used to love hiking through the mountains and visiting all kinds of parks.
Let's go up into the mountains north of Los Angeles, into the Sierra Mountains, and cover Little Miss History's travels to Sequoia National Park. Sequoias are a gorgeous tree. I've been there. I've seen it. People get confused between the redwood and the sequoia, and you describe the difference. What is it?
They look kind of similar, but they are actually different. The redwoods are taller and narrower. The sequoia are wider and heavier. The bark of a redwood tree is not as thick as that of a sequoia tree. The redwoods reproduce every year, whereas the sequoias reproduce every 2 years. And redwood trees can live up to 2,000 years, whereas a sequoia tree can actually live up to 3,000 years.
In your book, you talk about one 2,000-year-old sequoia that's still growing and adding enough wood every year to build a 5 to 6 room house.
Right. Actually, it adds enough wood every single year. And what we tried to do with that is to create that diagram. I have a tree, and then I have pictures of houses to try, to allow a child to visualize the immensity of that amount of growth in 1 year. And after a sequoia tree is about 10 years old, it starts producing seeds, and the seeds are only about a half an inch. And it's amazing to think that from this 1/2 inch seed, within 20 years, a tree can grow to be 65 feet tall.
And the sequoia tree is the heaviest, thickest in the world of all trees?
That one particular tree that I was talking about that is in the Sequoia National Park, by volume, is the heaviest tree in the world.
In reading your book, I didn't realize that the Sequoia National Park is the most polluted park in the park system because of the activity in the neighboring San Joaquin Valley and what's going on in the farmland, that the forest fires create so much air pollution in the trucking on the highways, the diesel freight trains, the food processing plants, thousands of diesel tractors.
Exactly.
Is anything going to be done to protect these trees in this natural area?
They are working on improving the air quality in Los Angeles, and I have to admit that in that area, I haven't really the basis of too much comparison as far as the northern part of California, because I haven't been there as many times as I've been to the southern part. But I know around Los Angeles it seems to be improving quite a bit from 10 or 20 years ago.
Let's hope that improvement continues. But again, going to the history, there were a lot of famous people involved in protecting this area. The founder of the Sierra Club, John Muir, was instrumental in trying to get it established as a park. FDR helped build infrastructure during the Great Depression so that people and tourists can enjoy the area. You have great people always involved in caring about our natural environment and doing something for it.
It's ironic that when they advertise for people to work at Sequoia National Park, they actually ask them to sign a disclaimer that they understand that at times it's unhealthy to breathe the air there.
Amazing. And we also need to remember, and you do mention the Native Americans who lived in the area, but let's not forget the wildlife. It's not just the trees. You mentioned that there were over 300 species of wildlife that called the Sequoia National Park home. The opossums, turtles, frogs, muskrats, beavers, and many more.
Those are the small wildlife, and then, of course, the mountain lions and the bighorn sheep and the brown bears, the cinnamon bears, the blonde bears, all of whom inhabit parts of the Sequoia area. And the other thing that's interesting, they have it's called the Lodgepole Visitor Center. It's run by the National Park Service, and it's a mini museum. And you can also look at exhibits of the geologic history of the park, and they also have some exhibits of the original Native American habitats, which were largely members of the Yokut Native American tribe. They actually guided some of the earliest settlers in the park, like Hale Dixon Tharp and Jim Wolverton. They helped them navigate territory.
Your books certainly give us a taste of what we can see in various places in the United States and know about them and learn about them. It's a great beginning for helping young people and adults know what wonderful resources we have. And we're going to talk more with my guest, Barbara Ann Mojica, when we return in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Barbara Ann Mojica. She is author of the Little Miss History series of children's books, which are also great for adults to read, even without children, because you mention so much in such an easy, delightful way with beautiful illustrations from your husband, Victor Ramon Mojica. You've also are a writer of monthly articles under Passages in the Columbian Insider. You try to get across both history, cultural heritage, and the natural history at locations that you've covered in your book, from Ellis Island, Statue of Liberty, FDR Hyde Park, Mount Rushmore, Ford Theater. We're going to talk about a few of those areas in a moment, but I want to go back to the North Pole, which I have flown over to but haven't landed. You made it clear that really the North Pole is a place on floating ice.
Yes, there's no land beneath the North Pole. It's a sheet of floating ice.
But underneath that sheet of ice, you have drawings of sea anemones and shrimp and Arctic cod. There are actually wildlife species that live there.
Yes, they do. They live under that frozen, what some would consider a frozen wasteland. It isn't a wasteland. It has lots of life within it, and there are also migratory birds.
Yes, you talk about the fulmar, the Arctic tern, the snow bunting. The big mammals like the polar bears, you say, are rare.
Yes, they don't actually live at the pole per se, but they all live in the Arctic area, what we call the Arctic Circle, which is the imaginary circle that we draw around the North Pole, just like we have imaginary lines of latitude and longitude. We draw this line called the Arctic Circle, and that kind of delineates the tundra, the frozen treeless area around the pole.
I like your map of the globe, a round globe with the North Pole in the middle, a different view of what we're usually looking at the globe from, and that the Arctic Circle does show the 8 nations that surround the area, the Arctic Circle: Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Canada, Russia, and the United States. You talk about the native people too, which we used to call Eskimo, but now Inuit. You also mentioned the important date of April 6th, 1909, when the first explorers reached the North Pole. And we hear about Robert E. Peary, but he was accompanied by 4 Inuit and the first African-American explorer, Matthew Henson. Those people rarely get the credit.
And Henson has only recently been acknowledged. The Smithsonian recently did an exhibit, and he's been now recognized, rightly so. I believe he actually stepped on the pole first. It's, hasn't been really technically proven one way or the other.
It was definitely a team effort, and I'm pleased that people who were part of these teams are getting the credits that they deserve. But half of this book talks about a character that most people think lives in the North Pole, Santa Claus.
Yes, of course we could not leave Santa Claus out, because when you say North Pole, who do you think of? Santa Claus. What I try to do is create the reality of how this came to be associated with the pole. It was Thomas Nast, a newspaper writer and famous cartoonist of the late 19th century. He was the one who first said that Santa Claus lives in the North Pole. He said that Santa Claus lives in Santa Clausville, NP, North Pole. And then I talk about the different names for Santa Claus in different countries. We have Father Christmas, we have Kris Kringle, we have Santa Claus, St. Nicholas. And I go a little bit into the legends, like Odin. Odin, Scandinavian myth, was a wild hunting creature, basically. And he used to go on these wild boar hunts. Supposedly, he traveled through the skies on a white horse with 8 legs.
Historians will definitely have to continue to research who did what, but I think there's no debate that there's only one day and one night at the North Pole.
Right, but the North Pole has no time zone because all of longitude meet at the pole. So technically the North Pole is in no time zone.
Tell me more about the natural environments mentioned in the other books in the series and what history we should be more aware of. I know, for example, Ellis Island, that families who had ancestors go through Ellis Island, like my family did, donate for their name to be on the wall. And it was delightful to go there in New York and see my family name on the island.
Ellis Island, that's a really interesting story. Ellis Island began as a 3-acre sandbar. The Native Americans called it Oyster Island, and they used to collect oysters there. And then it fell into the hands of a butcher in New York State called Samuel Ellis, and he sold it to the government. It became very important during the war. It was a military base during the War of 1812. And after that, it was sold to the federal government and eventually was enlarged to make Ellis Island, which began its history as the largest port of entry for 70% of the immigrants between 1874 and 1924. 70% of all Americans can trace their ancestry to people who came through Ellis Island.
And of course now it's not being used for that, but you can see the facilities that they went through. Another location that people think of as just the four faces of presidents carved into stone is Mount Rushmore. But tell us about the surrounding natural environment. And I know many miles away they're carving into a stone cliff that of an Indian chief.
Yes, the Crazy Horse Memorial. The Lakota Sioux are creating their own monument to honor their tribal chief, Crazy Horse, who, of course, was involved with the Battle of the Bighorn. And that's the territory around Mount Rushmore was originally given to the Lakota Sioux through a treaty. And later, the government reneged on that treaty and took it back. The Lakota Sioux are building their own monument, and they're carving this beautiful statue of Crazy Horse riding a horse. But they refuse to take government funding for it.
And this is all an area of South Dakota, so you can see the plains environment as well. You also mentioned some built environments, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Hyde Park shows us human estates, gardens, and historic homes. What can be found there?
At Hyde Park, you find the Presidential Museum of Fdr. He was actually the first president to donate his papers to the American people. His Presidential Museum today contains lots of artifacts, like the desk and chair that he actually used in the Oval Office, but it is also one of the largest research museums in the world.
The National Park Service manages large areas, Yellowstone National Park, Yosemite, areas up in Alaska, massive areas, but they also manage very small areas and more human-built areas that have historical significance, like the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C., or the Statue of Liberty on its own island there in New York City.
Yes. In fact, there is one national park monument to Kosciuszko that's only like a block long. So some of their facilities are huge, and others are very, very tiny. The Statue of Liberty, of course. Again, that has so many connections to the environment as well. The Statue of Liberty almost never came to be. On the way over from France, the ship, the Isère, nearly sunk, then miraculously able to continue its journey. But Hurricane Sandy did a lot of damage to the Statue of Liberty's base, and Ellis Island was really impacted by Hurricane Sandy, and they actually had to move many of the exhibits in the museum, the photographs, the photography that Augustus Sherman was able to capture so many of the immigrants in their native costumes. A lot of that was in danger of being destroyed because of the humidity, and it had to be shipped to museums all over the country to be preserved.
It's clear that historic areas, whether or not they're man-made or natural or a combination thereof, need preservation money and need protection so that we do have this living history preserved. And we need the ecosystems, the wildlife refuges, and all these other areas protected so that the wildlife have their home as well. You're constantly researching for another book in the series. Can you tell us a little bit what we can expect?
Well, the next book is going to be focusing on the Battleship USS Iowa, which has a long and interesting history.
Where is it?
The USS Iowa Battleship, located in the harbor at San Pedro, near the city of Los Angeles.
This gives people an opportunity to see what traveled across the oceans during wartime.
The ship was nearly destroyed, and it took part in World War II. It took part in later history, the Cold War. It was nearly destroyed by soldiers themselves, the sailors who were working on the ship. That's a long, interesting story about the missile explosion. And it had a very interesting sailor named Vicky, who was a mascot, the dog who was a mascot for the ship for many, many years. And when children visit today, they follow the trail of Vicky, who guides them throughout the ship, and she also shows them where the sailors lived, where they worked, how they communicated.
I certainly enjoyed my visit to the ship during Fleet Week when active ships come into the area and you're actually able to go on to them and see how they're currently operating, and even ships from other countries like Canada come to port. So again, you learn about the ocean, you learn about life in a different environment, that closed environment on a ship. It's great experiences to go to these places. It's great when we can't necessarily go to read your stories. It's hard on radio to describe the beautiful illustrations, colorful illustrations that you have in your book. Could you tell us more about how Victor Mohica created the drawings that he did, the style that he used, and the pictures of the people look pretty realistic?
Yes, well, if I had to use a word to describe the layout of the book, I would say mixed media, because in most of the books, we use actual photography from ourselves. So there are pictures that we have taken when visiting the sites. Also, the portraits are done by hand.
These are delightful stories, and I wish we had time to talk about all the other locations. How do you decide which places to cover and which places not to?
Well, there are places and people that I think children will find interesting, and in each of these books, I try to bring out characters that may not be well known. I try to emphasize that history is not just about facts and events. It's about real people who ate like we did, slept like we did, but became extraordinary for one reason or another. I try to emphasize when I see children and when I talk to them that everybody is a character in history. The moment we're born, we become a character in history. History is an evolutionary process, and if we want to build a better future, we have to understand where we've come from and where we are now. And my character has a saying, if you don't know your history, you don't know what you're talking about. Everything has a history.
What I love is the history of humans interacting with the natural world, and the history of the plants and animals and the general ecosystem and the environment that humans live in, worked in. That's so important that we understand that connection of cultural and natural history.
Well, if we look at our ancestors, what was the earliest form of history? It was families passing down their traditions and their culture to their children orally, long before we had formal languages, long before we had pen and paper. This is the way it was done. And that's why I try to make history a family effort, because history begins in the home. And a lot of parents today are very busy. They don't talk about their ancestors. They don't talk about the communities that they live in. And there's so much history going on right around us.
And I'm looking forward to more of your books featuring Little Miss History, because I see in one of these books in the Sequoia National Park, she's rafting down a river. Her adventures in the natural environment, I think, would be many more exciting stories for you to tell.
I have a lot of things in progress. There will be many more, hopefully.
Thank you so very much for bringing this history alive. Thank you so very much for presenting to us some wonderful information in a delightful way. Thank you for being my guest.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed talking with you today.
I have been speaking with Barbara Ann Mojica, who is an historian and a retired educator and author of the series Little Miss History. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.